This feels very intimate. Nye from Blockdaemon, Nye Lu, who is the chief engineer at Blockdaemon, is going to join me up here. Thanks everybody for coming on this rainy day 3. And so yeah, I think we're just going to sort of have a pretty casual conversation. People certainly can jump up if they have questions. But we are going to talk about decentralization, about the infrastructure that is involved in network participation, the challenges running it, what it means, how it works. Nye has, I guess I'll let you sort of start. Can you just talk a bit about what Blockdaemon does and about your role?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started around the same time Blockdaemon got started in 2018, initially running infrastructure, primarily for developers and some businesses. And of course, since then, we've expanded quite a bit to include a lot more protocols. We're basically delivering blockchain services and infrastructure to businesses that may or may not have their own in-house infrastructure or ability or experience doing it. And the idea is to bring them kind of seamlessly into the blockchain, into the ecosystem, and also in some ways kind of guide them into, depending on what their business goals are, which kinds of blockchains, what kind of consensus is good for them, and what part of the product line makes sense for them. Also, we've been involved in staking and some of the NFT activity, a lot of the cross-chain stuff we've been involved with. And primarily my role there is, obviously at the time we were building it from the ground up, so I did a lot of the initial work in making the operations infrastructure to be able to handle a bunch of different protocols. And since then, it's kind of morphed into a slightly different role, which is to try to basically cat herd, because we support 50 or 60 different protocols, and finding ways to support all of them and onboarding new ones and keeping those all maintained and monitoring them and categorizing them into how that works into our product line. It's become less of an operations work and more of a how do we kind of fit all these different square pegs into similar round holes so we have a coherent story that's consistent across all your protocols. So yeah, it's been an interesting challenge.
And Blockdaemon has been part of the Stellar ecosystem and supporting Stellar as a protocol, I think, since the beginning, near the beginning.
Yes, absolutely. So Stellar was literally one of our first protocols, right? You think about it, it's basically Bitcoin, Ethereum, Stellar. That's basically how we started. So we were one of the first T1 validators, and we still are today, obviously. And we're committed to the Stellar ecosystem and the community in general.
Has it gotten harder?
So it would be easy for me to point fingers and say, yes, of course, it's gotten harder, Stellar. But the reality is it's gotten harder across every single protocol. And they all pretty much share the same growing pains. And I think one of the things that people don't realize is that I think everybody gets so narrowly focused on their one protocol that they forget that there's others. And this goes spreads across all the ecosystems. So you've got the people that are doing the Stellar development, you've got the people participating in the Stellar ecosystem, and all they kind of see is maybe Stellar, and they don't really realize that there's 50 other protocols, and guess what? They all have the same growing pains. So pretty much whatever you see technologically, they're all kind of the same technology, and they see the same challenges. So the answer is yes, it has been getting more difficult. But again, it's part of the way things work.
Right, it's more difficult across protocols, across the broader blockchain ecosystem. Why does it get harder?
Why does it get harder? Well, I mean, the number one obvious reason it gets harder is because obviously the ledger's always growing, and because it's immutable, it never shrinks. And certainly as you get a certain kind of level of uptake, the density increases. And depending on how the chain is designed, that density can either become a catastrophic performance-wise, or it can just be something that you just kind of incrementally deal with.
And by density, you mean density of transactions.
Exactly. If on the initial uptake of a protocol, they might have a couple transactions an hour, right? And then as it grows, that could go basically up until the extreme limit. And as they need new features, if they add smart contracts, or the densities, the transactions themselves become much more complicated, they add multi-sig and all these other sorts of things, and each one of the transactions becomes incrementally larger. They have more metadata, they have more participants, they have more signers, there's more data that goes along with the smart contracts. So all that contributes to the density of the ledger itself per block or per ledger increasing over time. The challenge for somebody like Blockdaemon is if we can't predict that, it's very difficult for us to tell our customers what their costing model is going to look like. Because unfortunately, at the end of the day, we have to pass it along. So that's one of the issues. And the The second one is definitely archives, right? So getting a full history becomes extremely difficult as a ledger grows. So you can get a recent history, it's pretty straightforward. But once it gets deeper and deeper, then you run into all kinds of performance and scaling issues.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this, and I don't know if, I think maybe you don't know the answer, but I'm so curious how many people actually need ancient history, right? Like how many people are querying data from back in the origins of the network versus like the past hour or past week?
So I think surprisingly, it's pretty equal. There's kind of an equal distribution, it seems, more or less. I'm vastly generalizing, but it seems like you've got several categories of users, and the distribution is fairly consistent. I think by and large, maybe the largest proportion are most interested in performing transactions, right? So they're interested in just submitting transactions. And then I think maybe 50-50 historical data, they're either looking at an event stream, as transactions come in, it triggers an event. And the second one is either one of two is looking at transaction history for accounting and all these other kinds of things, or data mining for oracles and other kinds of things. And those proportions are pretty much the same, I think, across a lot of different protocols. You'll see that consistently. So as Blockdaemon has added protocols, we already kind of know ahead of time almost that we can't just omit one of those cases. We have to include them all.
Right. So you really literally have to be able to build for all those different audiences. Yeah.
That's exactly, and across all protocols, not just Stellar.
Right. Yeah. And how many, sorry, I think you said this, but how many protocols at this point, ish?
50-ish, give or take. There's some churn. It's harder for us to get rid of them than add them, but yes.
Wait, have you gotten rid of any?
Possibly we may have. We won't talk about those. I don't want to talk. we won't go there right now.
So I do want to talk. I mean, one thing that interests me, and it's sort of what the title implies, the title of this talk, is like Stellar obviously has a very different incentive model or non-incentive model for validators that's sort of baked in at the consensus level, right? Like unlike proof of work or proof of stake that reward validators with token incentives, Stellar does not rely on those mechanics. And I'm sort of interested in what that feels like from Blockdaemon's perspective. Like for you, is that a challenge? What is the challenge? What should we do about it?
Got it. So this is actually it sounds like a scary question, but it's actually a very easy one for us. And the answer is we're interested in all kinds of decentralization, not just the obvious protocol ones, but also decentralization in far as the kinds of consensus that all these different protocols do. And the reason is because we have a lot of different customers. And as we onboard customers, they all might have different kind of requirements and they have different kind of priorities. And for some of them, proof of work, proof of stake may not be appropriate for their solutions. And for something like Stellar, depending on how you want to call it, either federated or proof of authority, these sorts of things are more attractive to certain kinds of customers. So for Blockdaemon, it's very important for us to cover all the bases. So no matter what customer wants to come to us and they have a particular project in mind or they want to get involved in the blockchain ecosystems, we can talk to them and find out what the solution fits best for them, rather than forcing them to do a certain thing that maybe doesn't match what they need.
Are these are actual conversations that you have with customers? Like customers come to Blockdaemon and they say, we want to get in on this blockchain thing. Tell us which chain to use?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So that's a tricky part of sales sometimes, is either convincing the customer that maybe what they're thinking isn't where they should be, or listening very closely and making sure that you can match their requirements with something you have. And it's a difficult balance. But I would say, in general, the customers that are coming to us that want involvement in the Stellar ecosystems are very aware of the differences and why the Stellar's consensus fits with their requirements.
So, okay, that's interesting. The customers that come are actually aware of the consensus protocol, and it is a factor in their decision to use Stellar? Is that accurate?
I believe that's the case. I think that is the case. And maybe it may not be something direct. They may not have the direct technical understanding of what it is. But for whatever reason, either things they've heard, or other people or consultants they've had, or roundtable discussions they've had, or things they've seen on the internet, or they've come to places like this where people discuss things, they've kind of gathered their own kind of ideas of where they want to be. And then I think the other thing that we're seeing, which I think is very interesting, is what's driving a lot of this interest in other protocols is it's coming a little bit out of the contraction in the winter a little bit, because you're seeing a lot of the speculations, kind of those guys are kind of the volatility seekers and the quick uptake seekers are kind of like starting to fade into the background, and you're seeing more and more people actually interested in the core technologies. They want to build platforms, they want to build bridges across different kind of networks, and they're much more interested in the actual technical solutions of problem solving necessarily than making the quick buck, which I think is a really interesting thing and also very healthy for the ecosystem as well.
Right. So does this actually help? Like, does this make your conversations in the current climate like actually better than, or easier, more interesting, more engaged? Are there more informed, more engaged customers? They're coming to you now because of the crypto winter, right? Does it make your work more interesting, better, easier?
Yes, all of the above. I believe it does. So for all the negatives of the winter, I believe it makes the discussions much more interesting. It definitely brings a lot more people that are more aware, and also just the maturity in general of the blockchain ecosystem, I think. So the discussions that we're having with these customers are becoming more and more sophisticated, where back in the early days, it really was a matter of they just would come to us and, we just want to get involved, tell us what to do. I think more and more customers are more and more aware of what they're really looking for before they come to us. Or actually, a great example would be, they've actually started with a bunch of different protocols, and they've talked to the public endpoints, for example. Stellar has their own. And whatever applications they're starting to develop, they no longer scale because the public endpoints don't have the performance or the bandwidth or the rates that they're looking for. And then they come to us. So they already have all their requirements already in mind. They have a lot of proof of concepts already built. And that makes the conversation even easier.
Right. So that's a typical path. People build prototypes, maybe even go into early production on some public endpoint and realize that they need a Blockdaemon when it's time to scale, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. We're seeing that more and more. And not just, it used to be in the early days, it was just, the independent developers. But now it's institutions and large companies and banks and, all these investment communities and the traders and all these things there's already starting to build all the prototypes in-house and then looking for somebody else for endpoints.
A service provider like Blockdaemon that is providing a point of access for all these different organizations, does that create centralization?
So the answer is, at least we try to make sure that at least internally our own way that we run nodes is decentralized. So we want to try to spread ours both geographically. We use a variety of different clouds. We have our own data centers. So we prefer, I think what we really want is a community that has options, right? So that we don't, I shouldn't say we, but at least I don't think everybody should just go to Blockdaemon and that's it, right? Everybody should look around the ecosystems, find out what's the best fit. And hopefully part of that is also looking at other providers for things. So there is a good amount of decentralization. That said, though, I think one other thing that has become more and more apparent to Blockdaemon is that decentralization is more of a concern for when you look at the validator side, right? You look at the actual consensus side, whereas Blockdaemon's kind of split between providing validators for people who want to run validators, running our own validators and having people stake to them, participating in the Tier 1 validator program with Stellar. And the other side of things, which is almost a completely different product, is services. And from that perspective, I think a lot of those things can be, centralized is kind of a dirty word for validators, but I think for RPC services, it maybe not. Maybe you'd want to look more of a traditional model for large scale, where their own decentralization is baked into their own architectures,
right,
HA and stuff.
That makes. Obviously there's availability issues, but at the same time it makes sense if you're using the service endpoints, right? That it's pretty to rely on a service provider may actually give you higher reliability. In other words, if I would do a worse job running my own infrastructure than if I got you to do it, right?
Yeah, we would like to think that's the case. And part of it is even though we are centralized, we can provide much higher availability, much better SLAs, plus not only that, but all kinds of guarantees to the SLAs, which you wouldn't necessarily you wouldn't have that ability to do that independently. And we could do things like auto scaling and load balancing and caching and geo redirection and all these kinds of things that a small independent person just kind of doing on their own might not be able to, and that would actually lead to the network being less stable. So in a lot of ways, at least for the services side, it kind of makes sense. The network probably becomes more stable the more you have both enterprise and the kinds of infrastructure providers that scale well and provide that level of service.
Right. But a level down, like at the validator level. So let's go there. I mean, it's been interesting because, last night in this very room, we were sort of walking around, you and I, and we were talking to other people that are in the tier one group, some of whom are here. It's interesting because right now, Stellar does have a certain amount of decentralization, but it's a small, a fairly small set of organizations. And the question, well, first of all, did you learn anything talking to any of the tier one validators last night?
Well, I think our discussions were mostly more concerned with the operations side and maybe less so with the ideological questions of diversity of validators. But certainly there were some other things that did kind of spark my interest in trying to figure out the best way to bring diversity to the validator sets. That's unfortunately something that Blockdaemon can't specifically do on our own.
I thought you were going to solve this.
No, unfortunately.
For the entire
world.
industry.
Yeah, we have a solution. We'll fix it, don't worry. No, but that is a big concern, and it's something that we don't necessarily want to get too involved with whatever the incentive structure or how blockchain developers attract validators. We'd much rather just kind of enable. So if there's something that they're looking for, if they're looking for feedback from us, or I'll give you a more direct example. A more direct example might be, so one of the things that I'm going to get maybe a little technical here, but
sounds good.
But we'll do that anyway. So if for example, I was the talk from I think David last night. He talked a little bit. He had kind of his idea of setting up quorum sets, where the individual person can decide which kind of validators they trust and to what proportion they could trust those validators. Now, from a user interface perspective, Blockdaemon would need to expose that to a user, and that could be problematic for a lot of different reasons. The most obvious one is that if you make it too flexible, you possibly could endanger the stability of the network. So if you allow the user to make some sort of customization that makes the validator not participate well or cause a fork, we're in trouble.
Right, they could choose a validator set that doesn't overlap enough with others on the network.
Exactly.
To lead to quorum intersection problems.
Exactly, or they might not have the threshold for the quorum threshold set correctly, and that there's a high risk there. And it's something that we don't necessarily want to take on that risk, and to expose all those extra dials and knobs. So then we would go, and then at that point, we would have that conversation. It's like, what can we do to make that a lot more resilient, a lot more reliable, some way of making it predictable? So have some sort of automatic settings that, or some sort of sanity checks that can be done. And it's not something Blockdaemon would be able to do because, despite the fact that we have incredibly talented engineers, we can't keep track of all the different consensus models. So that would have to be a two-way conversation with Stellar.
And what would what kind of information would you need? So just right now, when people are using Blockdaemon validators, would they just come with sort of a default configuration?
That's exactly right. Now, so for us, that's the approach we would take, which is like, well, we know this; it's a known working configuration. Like, we know we have these validators, and they've been running fine. We've got this many nodes, and they work great. But that's not ideal. I mean, we can guarantee that it's going to work 100% of the time, but it doesn't really fit with what we think should be happening in the validator space. And the other thing with, at least for Stellar, most of our customers, they're looking for services. They're looking for Horizon endpoints. They're not necessarily looking to run validators. That has to do more, again, a little bit with the incentive structure of why people run validators. And that is something else that, Blockdaemon, we don't want to be the only ones running validators. We want to see a vibrant community. We want to see a lot of other people running validators. It shouldn't just be us. Now, you can come to us and we'll run one for you, but I don't know that that's really great for the community either. But I do want to talk a little bit about the trust model there too, because while we're running validators for other people, we don't necessarily have, depending on the technology, we don't necessarily have control over the keys and the funds on the validator. And all we're doing is basically running a validator for them and keeping it running and putting it in the geography they want. But if you want to talk about trust models, and if the educated person wants to choose their quorum set based on external forms of trust, how much they trust an organization. In David's talk, it was like, either a big bank or the EFF or the ACLU, and they have that trust model in mind. Maybe it doesn't matter that we're running the nodes for them, because we know that whatever values they have, we have to reflect as people who are providing the service. If that makes sense.
Right. Assuming, but you mean at a general level, you would say, okay, I understand generally what you philosophically want, or do you mean at a specific level where it's those specific organizations that would be involved in they would add to their quorum?
Both. So I think both directions. I think that's a bidirectional conversation, right? The people that want to pick things to add to their quorums, and the people that want to decide which of the ones that are already there they want to add. And so for the case of somebody like, you want to talk about bad actors, right? They basically have to trust that these organizations that have chose Blockdaemon chose us as a reliable provider that maybe even provides even more trust, and an extra layer of trust, that there's some oversight to what happens on those validators. So even if they may not trust some big bank, but they trust the ACLU, maybe it doesn't matter because they trust Blockdaemon as a service provider, and they'll have trust that we're kind of keeping an eye on things. We're not going to let them run modifications on their validator, those sorts of things.
Interesting. So, I mean, I guess it is true. Like the sort of model for consensus on Stellar relies on reputation, relies on trusting in entities, right? Configuring your quorum so that you only look at people that you trust. And it is true that they could just trust Blockdaemon, right, on some level.
On some level, now I think it's an added trust, right? It's another belt and suspenders approach. I trust ACLU and Blockdaemon, and hopefully those combined provides the multiplicative effect rather than a either or effect. And I think especially with people, I think being rightly, the other reason that people come in and study, if they're rightly concerned about proof of work's use of energy, if they're concerned with proof of stake being taken over by secretive whales that collude, all these sorts of things. This is why, if you talk about this talk, this is why I'm here, because I'm interested in other solutions, not just those. And one of them is this off-chain notion of trust. Who do you trust? And can you trust multiple organizations? And maybe even the more organizations are involved in running the validator provides extra layers of protection, extra layers of trust. And it informs the end user as far as, who can they trust on the network? And conversely, do they trust the network more because it has things like that isn't found in traditional proof of work or proof of stake networks?
Right. So leveraging real-world reputation for
Exactly.
validation is interesting because of where it puts trust, right?
Exactly.
But I guess the challenge then is one that I think all networks face, but certainly we face when we think about Stellar is like, so in this model where there are no incentives, where people that validate on the network are using the weight of their real world reputation, how do you get the right people to join, to validate, to participate? I hope you have an answer for me.
I have an answer, maybe not the answer, but an answer. And I think ultimately you're looking at, again, I talked about before the crypto window, kind of shaking loose some of the speculators. And I think what's happening is you're attracting people that are genuinely interested in trust. They're genuinely interested in participating and helping in the ecosystem grow. And maybe it is a little bit idealistic, but on the other hand, it gives you a higher level of appreciation of the people that are providing validators, because they're not just in it for the quick turnaround. They're not interested in a mooting token, right? They're actually interested in the health of the network. So maybe that's kind of an implicit level of trust that doesn't exist in a purely, competitive, market-driven approach. But maybe that's some place that a lot of people are interested in still, and are nervous about validators that are purely motivated by just the bottom line. And we know that we know this across all different kinds of protocols. That there are bad actors. There are people that run validators that aren't trustworthy, and they're not interested in the health of the community, right? They're just there to reap as much profit as they can, as short term as they can, and that is a dangerous thing, and that's unhealthy for the entire blockchain community. It can be very damaging.
Interesting. I kind of feel like we've got, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes left, and I have a feeling there might be some good questions lurking out there. Does anyone have a question?
Hey, so in my past work with Stellar, I've been writing academic papers trying to explain the fundamentals of the Stellar model, and so it's a model that's really different from proof of stake and proof of work. It's not just a version of those. It has like real scientific depth, and even in my experience talking to people who have PhDs in computer science, it's been difficult to make them see what this is really about, because they always think, they have proof of stake, proof of work in mind. and it's hard to change your frame of reference. So I was wondering if this has been a problem for you with your customers, or maybe with your engineers internally. I mean, just understanding what this federated model, or what we call proof of agreement now, I think is all about.
Yeah, I guess the short answer is, at least for us engineering-wise, honestly, the type of consensus that a network has doesn't really affect our operations much. There may be some side cases with observability to if we're looking for how to determine performance or metrics and all these kinds of things, maybe some variation. But as a whole, the actual consensus model doesn't matter from an operations perspective. But it does matter a great deal when you have that conversation with a customer who may not fully understand exactly what that is. And that can be several layers. It could be what I talked about before, was the customization layer, where, how do we expose these complicated concepts of this trust model that is a very layered, complex, lots of kind of different moving parts, how to present to the customer in a coherent way. And the second thing is, does that match what their particular goals are? And again, we talked about this before a little bit earlier, where they have their preconceived notions of why they want to go with Stellar. And for us to come tell them, oh, well, you're wrong, that's a non-starter. So there's a question of, customer education is like, well, these are the kinds of things that do match with your goals, and these are the tools we want to provide to help you with that. Unfortunately, I think that's less of a case today. That's more of a future question, how that's going to shake out. Because like you said, there's so much focus now on proof of work and proof of stake, and as people become more and more accustomed to that, the customers are more and more aware of what that means. But as perhaps not necessarily distrust, but people are looking for alternatives, they may start preemptively going out and doing their own research. They might start to talk to developers. They might talk to some of the folks here that's come to this, some of these, and have discussions with them. And maybe, hopefully, we'll see a new breed of customer that is aware, that does understand exactly those complexities, or at least how, maybe not the complexities themselves, but how it applies to their business goals. I don't know if that answered your question, but long-winded answer of yes. A little bit of each.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain, right? It's hard
is.
to explain how Stellar differs, and it is. I feel like there is the mental model that you have to. There are a lot of assumptions that people have when they come with a different mental model. I feel like it's really hard to dispel those. Yeah,
but the same is true with all forms of consensus, because necessarily blockchain it's a complicated. Consensus is not easy, right? That's the end of. At the end of the day, consensus. If it was easy, we would have come up with this decades ago. But consensus is not easy. So even if you say, well, this, the federated or proof of authority model is difficult to understand, certainly proof of work, proof of stake, they're also difficult to understand. So it's about finding a way to bridge that gap between the papers and business cases. And that's obviously a challenge in all industries. I mean, it's not just unique to blockchain. That's universal.
Cool. I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. Final thought?
No, just I'm glad to be here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I really appreciate your being here, and it's also just like participating in the network, the level that you do, the amount that you just like sort of help people out in the channels, like who actually have questions, even though they should theoretically be paying you for those answers. It's really great. I'm so glad that you could come today.
Well, thank you so much. And it's one of my personal goals, at least at Blockdaemon, is to bridge those gaps with communities. I think it's something that Blockdaemon is definitely looking at, being more active in all the communities, not just the ones that I'm involved with. So I believe very strongly that that is the one thing that, if I would ask any participant in the blockchain ecosystem, is to be a real participant. Don't just consume. Have a bidirectional communication, work with people, work with them to find solutions, and I think it will make blockchain community that much stronger.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Justin.